The town of Ash Hollow sat crouched beneath a sky the color of old tin, dull, bruised, and heavy with dust. The wind came in low from the east, carrying the smell of horses, whiskey, and the tired breath of men who had long forgotten gentleness. Along the corral fence, boots scraped against the packed earth as a dozen onlookers gathered, their laughter coarse as gravel. At the center stood Clara Wren, 17 and small-boned, her wrists bound in twine. The wagon plank beneath her feet creaked with every shift of her weight. Her uncle, half drunk and half ashamed, called her a fair bargain to the crowd, his words slurring in the heat. A single fly circled her cheek, and she did not lift her hand to brush it away. Her eyes, gray as morning ash, looked out past the faces, past the saloon porch, past the town itself, toward the dry hills that walled the horizon. No one there remembered her name. To them she was just the girl who'd been left with nothing, too thin, too pale, too quiet. A burden, one man muttered. A wild one, said another. Coins clinked in rough palms and the bidding began. The auctioneer's voice cut through the evening like a whip crack. Starting at $20. Who will take the girl? Someone laughed. Someone spat. The air grew thick with mockery. Clara stood still, her bare feet pressing deeper into the splintered wood, her heart a small trapped thing in her chest. She had been sold once before, for a promise of food and roof. Now she was being sold again, and she had learned that promises carried the same weight as smoke. Then, through the jeers, came the hollow echo of slow boots on dry ground. From the far end of the street, a man emerged, tall, lean, his coat faded from years beneath the sun. Elias Hart. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but the left side of his face bore a scar, white and thin like a strike of lightning frozen in skin. He stopped beside the wagon, silent. The crowd quieted. 50, he said. It was more than twice what any man there had offered. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain. Clara's uncle squinted at Elias, then nodded, greed dulling any question in his mind. A few men muttered that Hart had lost his wits buying damaged goods, but Elias didn't look at them. He handed over the money, cut the twine from Clara's wrists, and turned away without a word. The girl followed because there was nowhere else to go. The sun was sinking, dragging its light across the plain in streaks of bronze and fire. Elias led his horse by the reins, walking until the noise of Ash Hollow faded behind them. Clara trailed a few paces back, her breath trembling in the evening chill. When they reached the edge of the valley, he stopped beside a weathered bay mare, swung into the saddle and held out a gloved hand. "Can you ride?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He pulled her up behind him with the ease of a man used to silence. The horse moved forward, its hooves sinking into the soft dust. The prairie stretched before them, endless, empty, and glowing faintly under the dying light. Grass whispered against their boots. Far off, a hawk turned lazy circles against the sky. The air smelled of sage and smoke. Clara's fingers, raw and cold, found the coarse wool of Elias's coat. She held on as the land rolled beneath them. He said nothing, and she did not ask where they were going. Words felt too fragile to survive in that wind. By the time night fell, they had crossed into the foothills. A single star flickered above the ridge, and the world seemed quieter than she had ever known. Elias dismounted, gathered brush, and built a small fire that hissed and popped in the dry air. "Eat," he said simply, offering her a strip of jerky and a tin cup of coffee. She took both without meeting his eyes. The coffee was bitter, but it warmed her throat. She pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little against the creeping cold. Elias sat across from her, silent, the flames dancing along his scar. His eyes were not cruel, only distant, like a man who had lived too long with ghosts. The firelight flickered across the rifle slung beside him, its barrel dull with age. Every motion he made was steady, deliberate and quiet, as though the whole world might break if he moved too quickly. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the low sigh of the wind moving through sagebrush. Clara's thoughts wandered. The night felt both safe and strange, too wide, too still. She wanted to ask him why he had paid so much, why he had bothered at all, but the words tangled somewhere deep in her chest. When she finally looked up, Elias was watching the fire. His voice, when it came, was low. "You'll ride with me to the ranch. Work's fair. You'll be fed." She nodded, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. "Rest," he said, turning his gaze to the darkness. "Tomorrow's a long ride." He lay back on his saddle blanket. She watched him for a moment, then curled near the fire, the warmth kissing her face. The flames burned low, throwing red light over the ground, over her scarred wrists, over his weathered hands, over the silence that held them both. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, its voice carrying across the desert. Clara listened until the sound faded, then closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she did not dream of being chased. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the night. The cabin sat against the low Wyoming hills, half swallowed by morning mist and the whisper of pines. Smoke trailed thinly from the chimney, curling into a sky the color of pewter. The land stretched wide and lonely, a scatter of pasture, wind and fences leaning with age. When Clara Wren awoke, she thought for a moment she had dreamed it all. The auction, the dust, the stranger with the scar. Then she smelled coffee and pine sap, and the ache in her shoulders reminded her she was still alive. The room was small, lit by a square of light from the window. A stove crackled faintly, its warmth soft against the chill. Beside it, a table stood with 2 tin mugs, a loaf of bread, and a knife worn down by years of use. Against the far wall, a single rifle rested above the hearth, polished to a dull shine. Elias Hart moved quietly about the room, his boots hardly stirring the floorboards. "There's water by the door," he said without turning. "Wash up, then eat." His tone was even, neither kind nor cold. Clara rose, still uncertain of her place. The floorboards were cool beneath her bare feet. She splashed her face in the basin, the water biting against her skin, then sat and tore a small piece of bread. Elias poured coffee and handed her a mug. "You can stay," he said after a moment, "so long as you work. Feed the stock. Keep the fire. The rest'll come in time." She nodded, voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. He didn't speak again. When he finished his meal, he took up his hat and stepped outside, leaving her alone with the smell of pine and smoke. The day passed in quiet labor. Clara found the stables behind the house, rough-hewn and leaning. She filled troughs, scattered feed, and spoke softly to the mare Elias had ridden the night before. The animal's breath puffed in the cold air, warm and living. Past the stable, a small garden waited beneath the shadow of the hill. Dry rose, brittle stems, a few green shoots pushing through. She knelt in the dirt, turning the soil with her hands, feeling the pulse of it. Life, however small, still lingered there. At dusk, Elias returned. He said little, only checked the horses and the fences before retreating inside. She followed, unsure if she was welcome by the fire. But when he gestured toward the chair across from him, she took it. The cabin glowed with lamplight. Shadows danced on the walls. Over the hearth hung a single dress, pale, delicate, embroidered with faint blue thread. The initial stitched into the hem caught Clara's eye. E.H. She stared a moment too long. Elias noticed, his jaw tightening. "My wife's," he said quietly. "She passed 3 winters ago." The words fell heavy into the silence. Clara lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, not looking at her. "Child too. Neither made it through the snow that year." The fire popped. For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind brushed against the shutters. Soft and mournful, Clara found herself tracing the embroidery in her mind, imagining the woman who had once worn the dress, her laughter, her voice, the way she might have moved through this same room. She wondered if Elias still dreamed of her. Days began to take on a shape. Dawn came with the hiss of boiling coffee, the groan of barn doors, the scrape of boots over frozen soil. Clara mended shirts, hauled water, swept the porch, her hands slowly forgetting the tremor of fear. Elias was a man of few words, but his silence was never cruel. When storms rolled in from the west, he showed her how to secure the shutters. When a fox raided the chicken coop, he taught her to set a snare. When she struggled to lift a hay bale, he took the other end without a word. Once, when the wind died at noon, he brought out 2 old rifles and set tin cans along a fence post. "You ever shot before?" he asked. She shook her head. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger slow. The first shot kicked hard against her shoulder, startling her laughter out into the open. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a heartbeat the silence between them felt almost like peace. Evenings were softer. Clara often sat by the hearth, brushing her hair by lamplight, the strands falling in dark waves down her back. Sometimes she braided them, tight and neat, as if binding the day into memory. Elias would sit nearby, carving a handle from an old piece of pine, his knife whispering through the grain. They spoke little, but small things began to live in their quiet. A shared glance when the kettle boiled over, a faint smile when the mare foaled healthy twins. The house, once hollow, began to feel inhabited again. The walls held their breath less often. One night, as rain tapped softly on the roof, Clara stood before the old wedding dress. The embroidery shimmered faintly in the firelight. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the fabric. It was softer than she expected, like the wing of a moth. Behind her, Elias said, "She used to wear it on Sundays. Said white made the world feel clean." Clara turned. "You should put it away." "It'll fade hanging there," he shook his head. "It's all right where it is." She nodded, understanding in a way words couldn't hold. Some things weren't meant to be hidden. Some ghosts needed a place to rest. When she lay down that night, the wind sang low through the chimney, and the world outside seemed impossibly wide. Clara closed her eyes, her hands no longer bound by rope but by purpose. She still carried her past like a scar, but it no longer burned. For the first time, she let herself imagine staying, not as a possession, not as a debtor, but as someone who might one day belong. The first snow came early that year, sweeping down from the northern ridges before the aspens had finished shedding their gold. By dawn, the world lay hushed beneath a pale shroud. Fence posts became white shoulders. Roofs bowed under weight, and the air itself seemed to breathe slower, gentler. Clara Wren stood in the yard, breath ghosting against the cold. Her shawl was pulled tight, her braids stiff with frost. She lifted the axe and brought it down hard against the log, the sound cracking through the silence like a shot. The wood split clean. She wiped her brow with the back of her glove, feeling the coarse strength that had crept into her arms over the months. From the porch, Elias Hart watched her. The light off the snow caught in his scar, silvering it. Something in his chest tightened. Not quite pride, not quite sorrow. She had come to this place small and frightened, barely more than a shadow. Now she moved with the surety of someone who belonged to the land. "Storm setting in," he called. "Best bring in the kindling." She nodded, gathering the split wood in her arms, her breath quick and white. Inside, the fire roared high, throwing amber light against the cabin walls. The smell of pine resin filled the air. By evening, wind began to howl through the valley. The world turned blind with snow. Elias bolted the shutters and checked the stock. Clara brewed coffee, the pot trembling on the stove as the wind rattled the roof. Then came the knock. Faint at first, then urgent. Elias froze. Out here, no one came uninvited, not in weather like this. He unlatched the door, and a gust of white fury burst in, carrying with it a man half collapsed against the threshold. His coat was torn, his face raw with frost, and blood darkened his side. "Help!" the man rasped before falling forward into the firelight. Clara gasped. Elias knelt, rolling the stranger over. The wound was ugly. A bullet lodged near the ribs, blood clotted black against his shirt. "Get water," Elias said. "Clean rags," she obeyed, heart hammering. Together, they worked to strip away the frozen coat, revealing a weathered man of 30, his beard unkempt, his eyes dull with pain. He smelled of gunpowder and old sweat, the stench of desperation. Elias pressed a cloth to the wound. "Bullets in shallow," he muttered. "We'll have to get it out." Clara fetched his sewing kit. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle. Elias held the lantern close, steady as stone. "You can do it," he said quietly. She swallowed, then bent to her task. The metal gleamed wet in the light. The man groaned, thrashing once before sinking into unconsciousness. The smell of blood filled the cabin, iron and salt mingling with smoke. When it was done, Clara's breath came ragged, her fingers red and trembling. "Good work," Elias said. He meant it. They laid the stranger on a cot near the hearth, covered him with blankets, and waited for his breathing to steady. The storm raged through the night. Snow whispered against the walls, wind moaned in the chimney. Clara sat near the fire, staring at the stranger's face. Something about the jawline, the voice, made it clawed at memory. She had seen him before, in another life. When she finally slept, she dreamed of a wagon, of men laughing in the sun, of her uncle's hand shoving her forward. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, and looked at the man again, really looked. It was him, the one who had dragged her to the auction. The one who'd tied her wrists, Her throat closed. Fear crawled through her like ice water. Elias was outside, shoveling snow from the barn roof. She sat frozen beside the cot, watching the man's chest rise and fall. Every instinct told her to take the knife from the table, to end it before he woke. But she didn't move. By mid-morning, the wind had softened, though the world beyond the door was still white and deep. The stranger stirred, groaned, and opened his eyes. His gaze found her, and recognition flickered there. "You," he rasped. "Thought I knew that face." Clara stiffened. "Quiet," she said. "You're hurt." He laughed weakly, a dry sound. "Didn't think the little bird'd end up in a place like this." Elias entered then, brushing snow from his coat. The stranger's mouth snapped shut. "You're awake," Elias said. "You'll stay put till you can walk." The man nodded, eyes lowered, voice smooth. "Much obliged, mister." But his smile lingered, thin and poisonous. For 2 days he stayed, eating their food, resting by their fire. Clara spoke little, but her fear grew with every passing hour. At night she dreamt of rope and laughter and that same sneer under a noon sun. On the 3rd night she heard a sound. The faint creak of the door, the hush of boots on snow. She rose from bed and saw him through the window. The drifter, coat pulled tight, Elias's rifle in his hands. "Elias!" she shouted, voice breaking the quiet. Elias came from the stable, revolver drawn, snow swirling around him like smoke. "Put it down," he said evenly. The man smiled. "You shouldn't have meddled, old man. Folks like her ain't worth—" The words cut short as the wind surged, hurling snow between them. Clara stepped outside barefoot, the cold biting up her legs. Without thinking, she grabbed the spare rifle from beside the door, aimed with both hands, and spoke through the wind. "Leave," she said. "Now." For a moment the drifter hesitated, then laughed and spat into the snow. "You've got his blood on your hands, girl." Elias's revolver didn't waver. "I've carried worse." The man's eyes flicked to Clara, then to the barrel she held steady. Whatever he saw there, the steadiness, the fire, made him falter. He dropped the rifle and backed away into the storm, his curses fading into the white. When it was over, Elias lowered his weapon and turned to her. She stood trembling, breath sharp, the rifle still raised. He took it gently from her hands. "You did right," her voice cracked. "He knew me. He was there." "I know," Elias said softly. "And he's gone now." The snow fell quietly around them, covering the tracks almost as fast as they formed. Inside, the fire burned low, its warmth a fragile promise against the cold. Clara sat beside it, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at the steam until it blurred her reflection. Outside, the storm began to ease. The world, once fierce and white, turned still again, and for the first time, she realized she was not the same girl who had once stood on a wagon plank, afraid to move. She had faced her ghost and sent it walking into the snow. By early March, the snowmelt began to whisper down from the mountains, slow at first, then steady as breath. The creek that cut through the Hart ranch swelled beyond its banks, turning the fields into glassy mirrors of gray sky. The ground, soft with thaw, sagged beneath every hoofprint. The wind had lost its bite, yet the air felt heavier, full of damp and promise. Clara Wren stood by the window, watching the rain blur the ridgeline. Water streamed off the eaves, drumming against the tin roof in restless rhythm. The world was coming alive again, but in its awakening was danger. Elias came in from the barn, coat slick with rain. "River's rising fast," he said. "Too fast." She looked at him. His beard darkened with water, hat dripping onto the floorboards. "Will it reach the pens?" "Maybe by nightfall. Cattle will panic if the bridge gives out." He set his rifle by the door, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "I'll ride down and drive him uphill." "Stay here, keep the fire." Clara hesitated. "You can't go alone." "I've done worse alone," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "This ain't your fight, but it was." Everything that had happened, every scar, every quiet hour they had shared beneath that roof, it was hers now as much as his. When he rode out, she watched from the porch, the rain swallowing him whole. The mare's hooves vanished in the mud, the sound of their passing drowned beneath the storm. She waited a long time, the sky darkening to bruised purple. Then the wind changed, fierce and sudden, and she heard it. A low, distant groan like the earth itself crying out. The bridge. Clara grabbed her shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders, and ran. The rain lashed her face, turned the ground to sludge beneath her boots. By the time she reached the creek, the river had become a roaring beast, brown and swollen, chewing at its banks. The bridge was gone, torn apart and carried downstream in splintered pieces. Across the current, she saw Elias, his horse knee-deep in floodwater, driving terrified cattle toward higher ground. The animals bellowed, eyes rolling white. "Elias!" She screamed, though the wind stole her voice. He turned, saw her, and shook his head. A command to go back. But she didn't. She couldn't. She waded into the torrent, the cold cutting through her like a blade. The current seized her skirts, yanking her sideways. She caught a branch, clinging tight as the water surged around her. "Clara!" Elias's voice thundered across the river. He spurred his horse through the current, muscles straining. The animal stumbled, almost went under, but Elias held fast, reaching her with one outstretched hand. "Give me your arm." She did. He hauled her up behind him, both of them shaking, soaked through, the horse trembling beneath their weight. Together they turned the herd toward the ridge, rain slicing down like broken glass. For hours they fought the storm, shouting, pushing, coaxing the animals through mud and water. Lightning flared over the valley, white and merciless. By the time they reached dry ground, they were both gasping, their bodies mud-streaked and raw. When at last the rain began to ease, they looked out over what remained. The lowlands were drowned, fences broken, feed washed away. The ranch had been half undone by the flood. Yet in that wreckage there was life, the cattle huddled together, breathing, the hills rising steady above the chaos. They made it back to the cabin near midnight. The fire had gone out, but Elias coaxed it back to life, his hands trembling as he struck the flint. The flames caught slow, orange against the soaked gloom. Clara sat on the floor beside the hearth, water dripping from her shawl. Her hair hung loose, dark and heavy, a few strands plastered to her face. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, his fingers shaking slightly as he handed her one. She noticed then how pale he looked, how exhaustion had settled into his shoulders. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "Could have lost you to that river. You could have drowned out there," she answered. "I wasn't going to wait for another ghost." For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of the fire. Then he exhaled long and low. "I prayed once," he said, "after they died. The wife, the boy. I prayed for the river to take me next. Thought maybe I'd earned it." Clara looked up, startled. His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, stripped of all armor. "I stopped believing in mercy," he went on, eyes fixed on the flames. "Stopped believing there was anything left worth saving. Then I saw you and on that wagon standing there with the world gone from your eyes. I don't know what made me speak or why I paid what I did, but something in you." He paused, searching for words that didn't come easy. "Something in you looked like hope, and I hadn't seen that in years." Clara felt her throat tighten. "You didn't save me," she whispered. "You just showed me I could save myself." He nodded once. "Maybe that's what I needed to remember too." They sat in silence then, 2 souls thawing before the fire, steam rising from their clothes like the ghosts of old pain leaving the body. The rain outside softened to a steady whisper, tapping gentle fingers against the window. Clara reached for the kettle, refilled his cup, her hand brushing his just briefly. Not by accident, not by boldness, but by understanding. Elias looked at her, and in his gaze was something wordless, not possession, not desire, but the recognition of another who had walked through hell and still chosen to build a fire. By dawn, the storm had passed. The world outside gleamed clean and fragile, every blade of grass jeweled with water. Steam rose from the fields like breath from a sleeping animal. Elias stepped out onto the porch, cane in hand, the light falling gold across his face. Behind him, Clara opened the door, her shawl around her shoulders, her eyes bright against the new morning. The land was scarred, but the air smelled sweet, like rain on new soil. She smiled faintly. "It's still standing," she said. "So are we," he answered. And in the silence that followed, the floodwaters whispered their retreat, carrying the remnants of the old world away. Summer came dry and unforgiving. The fields cracked beneath the sun, and the wind carried dust like memory, bitter, fine, and restless. Even the river, swollen months before, now crawled shallow and slow between banks of clay. The land waited for rain that never came. Clara Wren could feel the tension in the air, a heaviness that tasted like copper and smoke. At dusk, she would stand on the porch with a rifle resting across her knees, eyes tracing the horizon. The cicadas hummed in the heat, and the mountains glowed red as dying coals. Elias Hart sat beside her most evenings, whittling wood to keep his hands busy. "Trouble brews when the land goes thirsty," he said once, his voice low. "Men get desperate when the world turns mean." His words proved true before the month was out. It started with distant smoke, thin gray columns rising from the far ridge. Then came the rumors. A gang riding through Ash Hollow, burning ranches for feed, for horses, for the sheer satisfaction of taking what wasn't theirs. The sheriff was gone or dead. No one knew for certain. Elias and Clara fortified the homestead in silence. She gathered ammunition, stacked water barrels by the door. He checked the fences, the hinges, the rifles. When night came, they moved through the house like soldiers preparing for a siege. By the second evening, the sky glowed orange in the distance. The smell of ash drifted on the wind. "They're close," Elias murmured. Clara loaded the rifles. Her fingers were steady. She didn't pray. She didn't need to. Whatever God had listened before had gone quiet long ago. All that remained was resolve. They came just after midnight. 5 riders cutting through the dark, their torches hissing in the wind. The thunder of hooves rolled across the valley, waking the cattle in a frenzy. Clara saw them first. Shadows galloping through moonlight, faces masked with scarves, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Get back inside," he said quietly. She didn't move. "I'm not leaving you." He looked at her, a brief glance, proud and fearful all at once, then nodded. "Then stay low." The riders drew near, firelight licking their faces. Clara froze when she recognized the man at the front, the drifter, her uncle's man, the one she'd sent limping into the snow months before. His grin was wide and rotten. "Well, if it ain't the little bird," he called out. "Heard you've been keepin' house for the preacher. Thought we'd drop by for a visit." Elias raised his rifle. "You should have kept riding." The drifter laughed. "We ain't here for talkin'." He fired first. The shot split the air and chaos followed. The yard erupted in flame and gunfire. Bullets tore through the fences. Horses screamed. The barn caught like tinder. Clara ducked behind the porch beam, returning fire into the dark. The recoil stung her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Elias moved like he'd been born to battle. Calm, precise, unflinching. Each shot he took found its mark, each motion measured. But they were outnumbered and the flames spread fast. "Fall back," he shouted. They ran for the barn, half in ruins already, smoke thick and hot. Inside, the cattle bawled and kicked, terrified. Elias unlatched the pen doors, driving the animals out into the open, their bodies streaming past like shadows through fire. A shot cracked. Elias staggered. The sound was small, almost polite, but the blood blooming through his shirt was not. "Elias!" Clara screamed. He fell against the stall, breath hissing between his teeth. "Go," he rasped. "Get inside." She ignored him, slipping under his arm, dragging him toward the doorway. The barn roof groaned overhead, timbers glowing red. Smoke clawed at her throat, her eyes. Outside, voices shouted, boots crunching in the gravel. "Little bird," the drifter called. "You can't hide forever." Clara set Elias against the wall, pressed her shawl to the wound, and picked up the rifle he'd dropped. The wood was slick with his blood. She waited until she saw his silhouette through the smoke, tall, arrogant, sure of her fear. Then she fired. The shot caught him square in the shoulder, spinning him backward. He cursed, stumbled, and fired blindly, shattering a lantern. The flame whooshed up, devouring the night in a scream of orange. The others faltered, a moment's hesitation, and that was all she needed. She fired again and again until they broke and fled, their torches scattering into the dark like dying stars. When it was over, Clara dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside Elias. The fire had begun to die, smothered by the weight of its own smoke. The sky above them glowed faintly with dawn, pale, uncertain, the color of forgiveness. "Stay with me," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes clouded with pain but still sharp. "You're a stubborn thing," he murmured. "Could have run. I've done enough running." He smiled, a weary, crooked thing. "Knew you'd outlast me." "Don't say that. Listen." His voice faltered. "You remember what I said? That I bought you 'cause you looked like hope?" She nodded, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I was wrong," he said. "You weren't hope. You were proof. Proof of what?" that there's still good left, even in the wreck of things. His hand found hers, rough, warm, trembling. The firelight flickered over his face, painting his scar gold. Clara pressed her forehead to his shoulder, her tears darkening the fabric of his shirt. "You're not dying tonight," she said. "Not after all this." Outside, the cattle lowed softly. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. Not ash, not blood, but rain. She bound his wound as best she could, whispering small words to keep him awake. Stories of the hens, of the seeds that might yet sprout, of the river that would run again when spring came back around. The world beyond the porch was blackened, but the cabin still stood. The fence was splintered, the barn half burned, yet somehow the heart of the ranch endured, stubborn as the people who refused to leave it. By sunrise, Clara sat on the steps with Elias's head in her lap. The sky was pink with smoke and morning. His breathing had steadied, faint but certain. She brushed a lock of hair from his brow, her hands stained with ash. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We both are." The land smelled of char and wet earth, the first drops of rain falling onto the scorched ground. Each drop hissed softly like the earth exhaling. The fire was out. The nightmare, too. And in the hush that followed, Clara realized something simple and vast. She had saved him. She had saved herself. The girl who had once been sold like cattle now guarded her own home with a rifle in her bare hands. And when the rain finally came, she did not hide from it. She let it fall over her and over them both, until the ashes turned to mud and the world began quietly to live again. By late September, the valley breathed easy again. The hills that had burned black were green with new shoots. The earth washed clean by months of summer rain. The river ran slow and steady, its banks stitched with wildflowers and willow shoots. The world had healed, in the way that time always insists on healing. Not by forgetting, but by softening the edges of pain until what remains feels like memory rather than wound. Clara Wren stood at the fence line one morning, watching the cattle graze in the distance. Her braid had long since come undone. She wore her hair loose now, the wind tugging at it, turning it gold in the light. The girl who had once trembled on an auction block no longer lived here. In her place stood a woman who knew the rhythm of dawn and dusk, the weight of work, the quiet pride of survival. Behind her, the ranch moved with calm purpose. Fences had been rebuilt, the barn patched and painted. The garden, her garden now, was full again. Beans climbing poles, herbs drying on twine by the door, the faint hum of bees threading the air. Elias Hart moved slower these days. The bullet he'd taken had left him with a limp and a cane carved from mountain oak. But his eyes, once hollow, now held a steady light. He had lived through too much silence not to appreciate the sound of ordinary things. The clink of a bit, the creak of a saddle, Clara humming as she gathered eggs in the morning. Sometimes he'd catch her smiling at nothing, and he would smile too, though neither spoke of what passed between them in that night of fire. Words, they both knew, could only cheapen what had already been written into the bones of the land. One morning, as the first frost kissed the edges of the grass, Clara saddled her mare. The sky was pale, the air carrying the faint bite of approaching winter. She tied a small satchel to the saddle. Inside it, the wedding dress that had once hung by the hearth. She had spent weeks remaking it, unpicking every stitch, washing away the soot and time, sewing it anew into something simpler, a white shawl, light as breath. Elias found her by the gate, gloved hands resting on his cane. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Up the ridge," she said. "I want to see where the river begins." He nodded, though concern flickered in his eyes. "Take care crossing the creek. The ice will be thin this time of year." "I will." He hesitated, then smiled, that quiet, half-lopsided smile she had come to know. "Don't be gone too long. We got fence posts to set before the snow." She grinned faintly. "Yes, sir." And then she rode off, the horse's hooves thudding soft against the frozen ground. The trail climbed steep through pines and shale, winding toward the high ridge where the world unfolded in every direction. The air thinned as she rose, filling her lungs with the clean taste of sky. Below, the valley stretched wide and golden. The ranch, the stream, the rebuilt fences like scars turned into stories. When she reached the top, she dismounted and stood alone beneath the open heavens. The mountains beyond glowed white, their peaks sharp against the blue. The wind carried the scent of snow and sage. Clara untied the satchel and drew out the shawl. The fabric fluttered in her hands, part of a dead woman's dress, part of her own rebirth. She wrapped it around her shoulders and felt its warmth. The way it caught the light like water. There was no prayer, no speech, no audience, only the sound of the wind moving through grass and the faint, steady rhythm of her heart. For the first time, she understood that she belonged nowhere but here, not as someone saved, not as someone owned, but as someone free. She stayed until the sun began its slow descent, painting the world in copper and gold. Then she mounted her mare and rode home, the wind chasing her shadow down the slope. When she returned, Elias was on the porch, mending a bridle by lamplight. The lines of age and hardship had deepened around his eyes, but there was peace in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands moved without hurry. He looked up as she approached. "Thought the mountain might have kept you," he said, voice touched with warmth. "Almost did," she answered. She stepped closer, the shawl draped over her arms. The sunset caught in the threads, turning it the color of wheat and flame. Without a word, she leaned forward and placed it around his shoulders. The fabric settled like quiet blessing. He paused, fingers brushing its edge. "What's this?" "Something old," she said softly, "made new." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind sighed through the grass, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Elias looked out over the fields, his land, her land, and nodded slowly. "Reckon it suits me," he said. "It suits peace," she replied. He smiled at that, not as a man who owed her, nor as one who claimed her, but as someone who finally understood the cost and grace of staying alive. Night came gentle. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The lantern burned low, casting gold across the wood in their quiet faces. Somewhere out in the meadow, a coyote called, its voice carried by the wind. Clara drew her knees to her chest, the shawl around her shoulders, and felt the weight of everything that had come before. The auction block, the snowstorm, the flood, the fire. All of it still lived inside her, not as burden but as truth. Elias reached for his coffee, wincing slightly as he shifted his leg. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She shook her head. "This is where I learned to live. I don't need more than that." He nodded once, satisfied. The stars thickened above them, bright and endless. The wind grew colder, but neither moved to go inside. The world around them was simple now. Fences and fields, coffee and silence, the unspoken understanding between two souls who had walked through fire and come out whole. And when the last light faded beyond the ridge, the ranch lay quiet beneath the wide Wyoming sky, a small, steadfast place in a vast and merciful world.